There are many good interpretations of The Big Lebowski out there. It's one of those films that, despite having a lot to say on society and the way we live our lives, it doesn't ram its message down your throat. It explores several socio-cultural and existential themes, which have been very neatly wrapped in a fun, light-hearted story about a guy who's just trying to get his rug back. It is perhaps the very light-heartedness of this film that makes it so hard to interpret. It's not always easy to distinguish between a line of dialogue that is perhaps there to serve a purely comedic purpose, and those which are actually trying to tell you something deeper.
Look, Larry, have you ever heard of Vietnam?
Kind of like an English lesson where the professor claims to find far-fetched meanings in a particular book. Did the red curtains symbolize the bloodshed that was about to happen? Or were the curtains just fucking red? That kind of thing. To me, The Big Lebowski is very much a film of its time. It's part of a group of films made at the very end of the 20th century that try to figure out what the hell just happened. If you look at a graph of the earnings of the average human being throughout history, what you find is a near infinite line that is just above zero, with an explosive uptick over the course of the 20th century. And of all the countries in the world, the United States was the crown jewel of this economic miracle. Most working people could afford to buy a house, have a TV, a car, and have a little cash left to play around with. If those from centuries past could see how an average human lived in late 20th century America, they wouldn't believe their eyes at the sheer level of luxury that was available at an affordable price. The issue, however, was that despite living in what our ancestors would probably describe as a near utopia, people were miserable. The 5 films which really hammer this point home for me are Fight Club, American Psycho, American Beauty, The Matrix, and the subject of today's film, The Big Lebowski.
We'll be near the In-N-Out Burger.
Shut the fuck up, Donnie.
The really interesting thing about all 5 of these films is that they were all released within 2 years of one another. The 20th century was coming to an end, and people were realizing that everything they thought they'd ever wanted maybe wasn't quite so. The question was, of course, if making big bucks, having a nice house, a family, and a TV wasn't the answer, well then what was? What would be the consequences if we carried on living this lifestyle of endless consumption? Today we're going to assess my interpretation of The Big Lebowski's answer to the current existential crisis of the West. In my view, the film really centers around 3 themes: capitalism, nihilism, and what one might call dudeness. Let's start with the first. As I mentioned earlier, the film was made at a time when both America and the world had seen one of the greatest upticks in wealth that had ever occurred in human history, with capitalism being one of the primary driving forces behind this change. Humans were beginning to understand things like science, technology, and manufacturing, which, when combined with the capitalist profit incentive, led to a comparative gold rush for working and middle-class people alike. Deeply embedded in the capitalist mindset was the notion of individualism. The idea was that by empowering those that were capable, the so-called poppies could grow tall and spread the fruit of their labor to neighboring fields. The idea was very much one of, it's your responsibility and your responsibility alone to make a success of your life. No one owes you anything, so don't expect any handouts. I made it all on my own, and you should too. This rather one-sided view pretty much summarizes the speech of Jeffrey Lebowski, the rich businessman, and is a view held by many of the richer people in society. Of course, there are some pretty obvious flaws in this analysis. For one thing, it implies that everyone has a near equal opportunity to succeed, which is of course not true. People vary vastly in terms of their intellect, interests, and geographic location, with each of these factors playing a large role in determining one's economic success. Take even something like healthcare. Sure, you could argue all day about why private healthcare can be more efficient in terms of maximizing quality and bringing down overall costs, but the fact of the matter is, do you really want a society where one's ability to live or die is determined by their wealth? It doesn't seem to me to be an ideal way of setting up a society. But anyway, you can see Mr. Lebowski's outlook on life in his meeting with the dude. Rather than discussing what happened to his rug, and whether it was appropriate or not for Mr. Lebowski to compensate the dude, Mr. Lebowski goes on an angry tirade about the dude being unemployed and basically being a lazy git. Now, this of course is true, but it ultimately has little bearing on what happened. Later in the film, we find out that, in actual fact, Mr. Lebowski's wealth wasn't his all along, and in fact came from his late wife. Mr. Lebowski had no real money of his own. With this narrative, I think the film is ultimately telling us, just because you see a seemingly rich, self-made man, don't stand in awe. Things aren't always what they seem, and wealth is no guarantee of morality, meaning, or honor. The second theme is that of nihilism. With the film's critique of the stereotypical capitalist and individualist ideal, it seems to me as though the Coen brothers wanted to counterbalance this by making the antagonists nihilists. For those who don't know, a nihilist is simply someone who believes that life has no real purpose or values. Put more superficially perhaps, It's the view that humans are essentially just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. Regardless of what you do, we're all going down anyway. When Jeffrey Lebowski's wife, Bunny, leaves town, the Nihilists pretend to have kidnapped her so that they can ask Lebowski for a ransom. After all, if life is meaningless, you might as well have a bit of cash to play with, right? Now, I could be wrong, but in my view, the antagonists are expressly called the Nihilists for one core reason, and that's to inform you that the protagonist, i.e. the dude, is not a nihilist. I say this because the first time I watched the film, I myself wondered whether the dude was a nihilist, whether he saw no real purpose to life and was consequently trundling along aimlessly like a tumbleweed. Whereas in reality, I don't think that's true at all. And what better way to show you that this film is not a nihilist film than by making the antagonists nihilists? I don't think that this film is simply trying to tell us, life is meaningless, so don't bother getting a job or doing anything useful with your life. We're all going to end up dead in a Vietnamese jungle anyway. And this brings us very nicely to our final theme, dudeness. The dude is of course the hero of the story, or at least, sort of, because what's a hero anyway, eh? What makes the dude so significant is that he's not a Clint Eastwood, a Robert Redford, or indeed a Paul Newman. He's not the super handsome, sweet-talking, witty, funny, intelligent, fast-drawing American protagonist. He's not a successful businessman, a brave soldier, or a cowboy. He's instead just himself. He's a tumbleweed, rolling with the wind and going with the flow. He's just out there, taking it easy for all us sinners. What's particularly intriguing about the dude is that he's actually a pretty good person. He's a good friend to Walter and Donnie. He's happy to attend his landlord's slightly unorthodox theatrical performances. And perhaps most importantly, he's not an envious person. Even when at the beginning of the film, he asks Jeffrey Lebowski for compensation for the two criminals pissing on his rug when they mistook him for the big Jeffrey Lebowski. He doesn't do so out of spite, envy, or jealousy. Even though Jeffrey Lebowski isn't necessarily such a nice guy, the dude isn't some useless left-winger who just wants a handout. Put simply, he believes he's owed something and respectfully asks for it. Then when Jeffrey Lebowski turns him down, he doesn't get angry or resentful, and instead uses his wit to get another rug and goes home happy. The beauty of the dude is arguably his authentic demeanor. He's not here to push an agenda or get one up over his fellow man. He's just here to enjoy life and do the best he can. And here we get to the crux of what the Big Lebowski is all about in my view. And it's really something quite simple. It's saying, on the one hand, don't take yourself so seriously. Life's not all about how much money you have, the size of your house, or whether you have a photo with Nancy Reagan. On the other hand, don't go to the other extreme and be a pitiful, resentful nihilist. Life can be truly meaningful if you're willing to find joy within the little things, be it a white Russian, the company of a woman, or a bloody rug that apparently ties the room together. The dude may not be the savior of the universe, but at least he's honest with both himself and those around him. Sure, he's a bit of a lazy bum, but he lives his life according to his own ideals and principles. Basically, all the film is saying is, don't be a judgmental prick, or indeed a jealous prick, but just be an abiding prick.
Yeah, well, the dude abides.